lot has been said about why the Taliban were able to retake power in such a short time in Afghanistan. My guest says that one reason was that the U.S. troops lacked cultural understanding of the Afghan people. Baktash Ahadi was a combat interpreter for American and Afghan Special Forces for 3 years. Baktash, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You say that the majority of Afghans see the Taliban as the lesser of two evils. How can that possibly be when the U.S. put so much money into building Afghanistan?
The answer is really simple. The United States didn't take the time and effort to essentially understand the people that they wanted to serve, meaning that there was a difference of values and a difference of understanding where people are coming from. So if you can't meet people where they are, Mimi, then how is it that you're able to serve them?
Well, so give me some examples then of what you call cultural illiteracy that you saw there.
Absolutely. So let me share one of the biggest stories that I think made a lot of headway when it happened, but it's important to remind people now what that story was. In 2011, there was a Koran burning at Bagram Air Base. And as the story goes, U.S. military soldiers essentially picked up these books within Bagram Air Base, brought them to the burn pit, and burned them as though they were regular books. And what's interesting about the military bases all across Afghanistan is that Afghans would be working in them to provide their services. And so one of the people who was working at Bagram Air Base, an Afghan, saw that these books were being burned, and he brought them and showed his other colleagues. And all these Afghans who were Muslim realized that these books were actually the Holy Quran. And so this word kind of spread across the country, and protests actually happened all across the country. And it got so bad such that President Karzai at the time was threatening to kick out U.S. and NATO forces because we were disrespecting the culture. At least that's how it was perceived. And so this is a monumental example of how the United States didn't understand the things that they were dealing with, how important religion was in the context of Afghanistan, and how Afghanistan's history shows that the Afghans defeated the godless Soviets because they perceived them to be taking over their own country because of religious ideology. And so this is just one example of how the United States was unprepared, ill-prepared to understand what they were dealing with as a matter of these books, and that in the aftermath that ensued afterwards as well.
So are American troops given cultural training in addition to the obvious military training that they would go through?
Some are, but a lot of them weren't. So if you remember in 2009 when President Obama announced the surge, there was something like 250,000 military soldiers there at the height of the U.S. surge in Afghanistan. It was impossible to train all of them. It just wasn't a priority. On top of that, the majority of the people that served in Afghanistan stayed within the military confines, meaning stayed inside the wire. So think about this. The majority of people in Afghanistan there to serve the Afghan people never actually met Afghans outside the wire.
But Baktash, it wasn't safe to
that.
go outside the green zone. I mean, what were they supposed to do? They could have gotten kidnapped. They could have gotten killed.
Well, that was the argument. But in the context of those who served there at the time, Mimi, you'll understand that those that you asked, from 2010 to about 2015, it was actually quite safe to roam around Afghanistan. In addition to that, how is it that we're supposed to win the hearts and minds of the people if we're not interacting with these people? So there's a mismatch of strategy. There's a mismatch of how we're going about, or how we went about engaging, interacting, and serving those that we want to essentially be of service to.
So then, had American troops been more culturally sensitive, would that have made a difference in the outcome?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure, but I know that it's one of the reasons why the United States wasn't able to be successful in Afghanistan. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're doing is, the message that I essentially want people to kind of take away is that we need to be radically curious about the other. We need to be radically curious about the people in which we're serving. Because if we're not doing that, if we're not engaging people from a place of wanting to understand where they're coming from, especially people that have been now through 40 years of war, we have to understand what the psychology of war is like, what happens to people, how their notions of time change, how they're still in a scarcity mentality, how they're thinking for the day versus us in the context of the West. We are living in a world of abundance, so we're always thinking aspirationally about what we could be and how we can kind of get there. And so just as a matter of philosophy of time and those sorts of values, we're not we're not meeting people where they are. And more importantly, Mimi, is we're not actually understanding that they're actually starting from a different place. Right. So
Baktash,
simple things like that.
I want to ask you this, which is, what do you recommend to the Pentagon to do differently as far as training, as far as what the troops are prepared for when they go into, who knows, they might have to go to Afghanistan again or other countries?
Right, right. And my prediction is that the United States will be back in Afghanistan because of how the country's laid out, the geography, and how people are, how essentially large swaths of land can be commanded by who's in charge there. So I think what I'd say to the Pentagon is talk to Afghans. Talk to Afghans before you go and you engage the people in which live there. And that's the thing, is I don't think that's what's happening, is that decisions made, and the way the government works is that it's disseminated down. It's a hierarchy. And so if we're actually in the business of, if the United States is actually in the business of winning the hearts and minds of others, or essentially establishing relationships for the long term, that what we should do is engage in relationships like they matter. How do you do that? By asking questions, by giving people a place to speak, by meeting people where they actually are in order to essentially work in partnership with them to get them to where they want to go, where they meet their objectives, and at the same time work with us to meet our objectives.
All right, well, Baktash, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. I appreciate you being on the program.
Thank you for having me.